Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here with the one and only Gary Michuta. Gary is the host of, isn't it, on Virgin Most Powerful Radio. I've been on the show, I think, a few times. And obviously, people know Gary as an expert on the canon of Scripture. And today, we're here to talk about a recently published book of his with Emmaus Road Publishing titled The Gospel Truth: How We Can Know What Christ Taught. Gary, it's an honor to have you on the show.
Hey, it's great to be with you. I got to get you back on my show too.
Yeah, I
Um,
remember we had scheduled something and I think my schedule fell through or something happened. But yeah, we'll get
yep.
that fixed. So,
Yeah.
Gary, I'm excited about this new book of yours because as you talked about, I think in the kind of tagline of the book, so many books have been written in defense of the gospels. In defense of can we know really maybe what Christ taught? And so people will raise arguments about the recency of the documents to the original events, something along those lines as arguments. But it seems like in your book, you take a unique approach. What sets your book apart?
Yeah. Well, like I said, like you just said, there's a lot of great books. Most of them are written by evangelicals. You really don't find a lot by Catholics, which is a shame because I think the evangelical approach is rather thin
Hmm.
because it doesn't want to give full credence to the church as a real historic entity in a way, because there's a fine line, appealing to the early church that that dovetails into sacred tradition,
Yeah.
right? So they try to vindicate the gospels by trying to have as little attestation from that first community as possible. And more recent scholarship, however, has been going crossing that line, I think a little bit like was it Jesus and the Eyewitnesses? Is
Yeah.
that
Rev
correct?
Richard Balcom. Hmm.
Yeah, and other books like that. They're starting to flirt with, we use some of this data to support the church?
Hmm.
Where and the problem with that is I found that their approach is very thin. They focus on vindicating the text of the Gospels, the integrity of it, that our manuscripts are virtually identical to the originals. Uh, but the problem is it's very weak on the veracity of the Gospels. Like,
Hmm.
fine, our manuscripts are identical to the original, but how do you know the originals told the truth? How do you know they didn't exaggerate? How do you know that they didn't fabricate things or blow things out of proportion? And the other thing too is, and I've seen several atheists argue this. Fine, even if our text is identical with the original, even if it was written early enough that it could have been, they're in a position to give authentic and reliable information about what happened. How do you know the true meaning of what Jesus said and did?
Hmm.
Because there's such a wide variety of different interpretations that even if the project is accomplished, it still is meaningless because how do you know what the meaning of the text is?
Hmm.
And I think with the vindicating the text alone approach is very helpful to a point, but it has those blind spots. So what I
Hmm.
wanted to do was fill in those blind spots with my book.
Yeah. So, in your response there, you kind of mentioned multiple layers of criticism, right? So, textual criticism, what does the original text even say? Historical criticism, can we verify that these events actually happened as they're described? And then maybe on top of that, there's kind of just interpretation. So, there seems to be multiple questions here on can we really get back at what Jesus said and understand him? And I think that's why the tagline of your book is how can we know what Christ taught?
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, but it's not just the reliability of the gospels in terms of external historical events, although that's important, and historical markers, but it's like can we actually know what Jesus taught? And that it brings in the text, that brings in historical criticism, that brings in interpretation. So maybe talk a little bit about why you chose that subtitle.
Yeah, well, originally the book was titled Message Received, and
Yeah.
Scott Hahn preferred this, so I deferred to Scott, which
Yeah.
I think he's right. I think it is a much better title. But what I the ground, it's interesting. I've been doing apologetics for a number of years, and the situation on the ground has changed quite a bit. A lot of people today may have heard of the name Jesus, They
Mm.
don't have a clue who he is. They just think he's one of those mythological figures from history, kind of important, but not really interesting, right? And I think part of the problem is you have to connect them today with the actual Jesus in the first century, right?
Mhm.
And what's between that is the topic of the book, right? So that's basically what I'm trying to do, if that makes any sense.
Mhm. So could you walk me through a little bit, I
Yeah,
guess, the strategy of the book, how each of the arguments work? Just kind of give me a little bit of a snippet of what's going on inside the
yeah,
contents.
absolutely,
Mhm.
absolutely. Okay, I started off introducing Jesus, and I just want to get the reader to think, there's something strange about this Jesus of Nazareth, right? And he's there was this, as you know, there's this prophecy about that even pagans were aware of, that
Mhm.
there would be a leader that would govern the whole inhabitable earth that would come from Judea in the first century. And there's all these messianic movements that take place during the time of Christ. We learned that through Gamaliel and the Acts of the Apostles. And it's like everybody's gone. So was this a false prophecy? Well, there is one rabbi that is still influential today. In fact, he's influential around the whole world,
Mhm.
and that's Jesus of Nazareth. So I kind of piqued their interest that way, right? So then next thing is there any evidence that Jesus tapped into a mechanism by which his teachings could be accurately transmitted through time?
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay. And it's not by accident that Jesus chose the Jewish culture, because they already had this mechanism in place. It's a rabbi disciple relationship, or
Mhm.
sometimes it's called rabbi disciple circle. And so what I do is, okay, let's just look at the Gospels, assuming these are just documents from the ancient world, just to see if there's clues that Jesus taps into this. And what I show is not only does he tap into it, but it gives us ample reasons to believe that he utilized it to the nth degree,
Mhm.
right? Because let me give you an example. One of the things that about this mechanism of transmission is the prestige of the rabbi, right?
Mhm.
So you want to shop for the best rabbi, just like students want to shop for the best university
Mhm.
today. But Jesus was more than, he was a rabbi. He's called a rabbi repeatedly, but he's more than a rabbi. He's also a prophet who also had disciples. Um, and a prophet is essentially he who receives revelation from God and presents it. So that's notch, up a notch. And then you find out that Jesus is more than a rabbi, he's more than a prophet. He's actually the very wisdom of God. He's like a living Torah,
Mhm.
right? Which is the object of study for rabbis. So, that would make it incumbent, especially to learn everything he could possibly, everything he taught, and to study, right, what he
Mhm.
said. So that's one step. You want any comments or thoughts on that?
Well, one thing that kind of fascinated me about as you've explained the book is thinking about now, I should have asked this earlier, your audience.
Yeah.
Are you trying to argue with, let's say, secular historians, or are you trying to communicate with Protestants who might share certain theological foundations with you? What's your audience here?
Yeah, I think there is a shared audience with Protestants.
Okay.
I think I actually try to go over material that they skip or just give summaries of it,
Mm,
and but it's also geared to the unbeliever, the
I see.
inquirer.
Hmm.
Yeah, um, and yeah,
Yeah.
okay,
Well, if I could ask another thing too, I mean,
yeah,
it sounds like already then you're taking a lot of consideration into Jesus's Jewish context,
mhm.
and so maybe to kind of before I interjected, maybe using that as a way to talk about your book. Why does the Jewish context matter for getting at what Jesus really taught?
Yeah, because I found that most atheistic arguments that, like the mythicist, almost deny the Jewish background. It's almost like Jesus was a Gentile,
Yeah.
and so he or whoever fabricated the Gospels had an eye to fabricating it like the Gentiles, right?
Mm,
But that is so different because the Jewish culture, I think, is unique in that it really did put a premium on like passing on all the minutia of teaching accurately generation to generation. And in my book, I showed, several different things where you could see where, yeah, Jesus is utilizing this and people realized he's utilizing it.
Mm.
Another thing that I go into is what I call it's fabricated for accurate recall. So not only did Jesus tap into this culture, but as we're just looking at the Gospels, just like ordinary, ancient documents, we see really strange things go on. Okay. And these strange things are actually layers of formatting. In other words, the Gospels are kind of encoded in such a way as to promote accurate recall. Okay. And the weird thing, Swan, about this is some of those layers are actually hidden. Okay. Because as you well know, and this is well known in scholarship, there is evidence in the Greek Gospels, those are the oldest manuscripts we have are in Greek, that there is underlying pre-canonical source material being used. And that source material is either Hebrew or Aramaic, right? And like I said, that's well recognized. The question is, well, how much of it is and how much do we know what is said by these sources, right? That comes through the Greek translation. But, there's some things in the things that we do know are usually word plays or so, that's something you could really nail down to say, yeah, the Hebrew must have said this, because if you do it in Hebrew, you get this really interesting thing going on, right? And I'll share with you one of my favorite examples, and then we can move on. It's in the Benedictus in Luke, okay? And there's a few lines in the Benedictus. To perform the mercy promised to our fathers, to remember his holy covenant, the oath in which he swore to our father Abraham, okay? In English, nothing special, right? Just kind of recounting sacred history, right? In Greek, nothing special. Same thing as English, right? But when you look at it with an eye to Hebrew, okay, you find this, that the word to show mercy in Hebrew is Hanan, which happens to be the root of the name Yohanan, which is the name John. Okay. The Hebrew word for to remember is Zakar, okay, which happens to be the root of Zachariah, right? The name Zechariah. And to swear an oath is Shabbat, which is the root of the name Elisheba or Elizabeth, right? So within those three lines, you have the name John, the roots of the name John, you have the roots of the name Zechariah, and the roots of the name Elizabeth, the three progenitors of the narrative, right? So if you're reciting this or you're trying to recall, those lines, all you have to remember is John, Zechariah, and Elizabeth. You got the root words for, to show mercy, to remember, and to swear an oath. And this is hidden, right? It's not there in English or Greek. So how does that work if it's a fabrication, right? If this is a legend, a myth, things that we're ripping off from the Greeks, why would you go through the trouble of inserting this kind of formatting memory devices? And even more perplexing is, why hide it? If you're trying to pull one over on your reader, you don't hide stuff. You want them to see it, right? And that's just a small sample of, these little clues that there's a lot going on underneath the Greek Gospels. And they seem to point to a kind of memory device that's being used.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So, and if you can find that memory device, then you know that it has an older, let's say, background source, right? Because it would have to be passed on orally, transmitted. And so it's not as if when they wrote it, that's when it was made. No, it predates it. Yeah, it predates the text, that is.
Yeah, so the dating for the Greek canonical Gospels actually predate with the pre-canonical sources, right? So it moves even closer to the events of Jesus.
Right.
And then there's other things too, like rhyme and rhythm. How is it that we can fill in the lyrics to a song with word for word accuracy, or maybe like rhyme, like hickory dickory dock. We can fill that in, and even if you don't remember the words, the rhythm, da 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 da, right? you find the same thing in the New Testament. There's rhythm and rhymes to what Jesus says in the narrative. And the thing is, scholars know about this. This is part of Hebrew poetry. Um, but and to the average reader, it just seems like Bibleese. That's just the way they spoke back then. But actually,
Yeah.
but these are memory devices, right? Because
Mm.
if you remember the construction of these different ways of formatting, you can, even if you forget a part of a line, you could fill it in, just like you could fill in a nursery rhyme or the lyrics to a song.
Mm.
Yeah, and there are several others. Jesus chooses certain venues, like Matthew 16, right?
Yep.
And so you actually have visual things, visual aids to remember the discourse he gives at that point. Or feast, like tabernacles. When Jesus says, "He who's thirsty, come to me and drink," there's a water ceremony in tabernacles. So if the first readers go to the feast, they'll recall what Jesus says because they're pouring out water on the altar, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I go through, and it's like multiple layers of formatting. And by the way, just, because I know Matthew 16 is your wheelhouse,
Yeah.
I found the most layers of formatting is Matthew 16.
Wow.
Yeah, all these different lines, that I could go into. But
Sure.
so it was a very important discourse to be remembered accurately.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I'm
yeah.
almost so tempted now to just have you talk about Matthew 16, maybe just talk about that if you will. And then we can get back on track, but well, I mean, this is still part of the book, so just talk to me about what you found in Matthew 16.
Boy, you're putting me on the spot. I got to remember what I wrote a couple of years ago.
Oh, you're good.
Uh,
If you want
uh,
to just summarize or just kind of give some broad points, that's totally fine too.
I already, let's see, I already kind of did.
Hmm.
Okay, first, we find two layers of formatting. There's a 4-beat Aramaic rhyme going on.
Mm.
There's also an Aramaic wordplay,
Yeah.
kappa kappa, right?
Hmm.
Um, and then you have the formatting of the location
Yeah.
that also supplies the meaning. I'm just quickly looking at this. Yeah, I think that there's just more though, but
Sure.
that's my little summary I give.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's totally fine.
yeah,
Um,
sorry. It's
no.
like an Easter egg in my book. Yeah, I kind of have to hunt around for a little bit.
Yeah, you're
Uh,
good.
yeah, if I think of some, I'll remember. I'll
Sure.
tell you.
But Gary, I remember something that you mentioned to me in an email was that the book talks about how uh in the gospels you have Jesus performing miracles, and you describe them as kind of, I guess, the accounts as writing big checks,
Yeah,
as inviting people to seemingly verify what's going on. Could you talk about that with respect to the miracles of Jesus?
yeah. That's another thing that I think is missed a lot, right? If you go to the bank, you want to cash a check for $5 or $10, they'll just run it through the machine. You get your money, no problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to cash a check for like $250,000 or $1 million, you're not going to go through the drive-through, right? They're going to call up the bank. They're going to verify the funds are there. You're going to have to get your ID out. Why? Because they're undergoing a risk. If they give you $1 million and it turns out to be a fraud,
Mm-hmm.
they're out $1 million. So they'll check it out, right? So what I do in the book is I go through the Gospels and I show that the Gospels are actually writing some really, really big checks about what Jesus said and did.
Mm-hmm.
Miracle claims, that he's the God of Israel. Um, so it's almost like a dare to verify. It's like the Gospels are saying, uh, you know, Jesus did all these tremendous stuff. And now this is the other thing. They don't shy away from giving their location and sometimes the audiences,
Right.
right? So they're writing huge checks. And whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, becoming Christian had extremely high risk, right? You'd be kicked out of your family, you could lose your job, you could be beaten, you could even be killed, right? Or your reputation would be lost if it's fake, right?
Mm.
So we already have a preceding situation where you would check it out. The Gospels dare you to check it out, and the question then is, did they check it out? And let me give you an example. This is one of those fun things. I was John 6, the bread of life discourse. Okay, tell me if you notice this, because this used to bug me. Jesus is giving this discourse, and it's he's famous because he loses disciples because of what he says, right? You must eat my flesh and drink my blood. He repeats it over and over again, right, Swan?
Yep.
Then all of a sudden, the narrator jumps in, and it's like old time TV, right? Whenever something happened in the news, we interrupt this program to give you a very important, news item. They give the news item, then they say, now back to your previously scheduled program, right? And when you're reading John, it's like that. Jesus is like, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. Then all of a sudden, the narrator jumps in and he says, these things Jesus said while preaching at the synagogue in Capernaum. Now back to your regularly scheduled program, right? So you have to ask yourself, why does he jump in at that point in the text to give, details? Well, some scholars say, well, maybe this is two discourses stitched together, and that's the way to stitch them together, or something like that. But to me, it makes perfect sense that a reader who's hearing Jesus say these incredible words would doubt whether Jesus actually said it, right? They would doubt the veracity of the gospel. So the narrator, I think, feels that and feels the need to jump in and tell specifically not only where he says it, but the audience. In other words, if you doubt that Jesus said this, go to the synagogue in Capernaum and ask the people there,
Yeah.
So it's like a double dog dare, We double dog dare you to check it out. And I go through and I show, you find evidence even in the New Testament that people did verify, they did investigate the claims of Jesus. That's one of my favorites. I love veracity arguments because it's like a court case,
Right. Well, you did talk about like the early church fathers and other people who might have tried to look into the evidence and verify the claims of the gospel accounts. So maybe could you talk about, some of those people who went out and tried to verify or debunk those claims?
Yeah. Well, one person's Hegesippus. I don't know how you pronounce it. I've heard it pronounced a few different ways.
Yeah.
He traveled all around. We only have fragments of what he wrote.
Unfortunately,
that would be one. Yeah. There's another one that's fragment that's Quadratus, and he's writing to the emperor, and he kind of makes. It doesn't say that he checked out the claims, but what he writes to the emperor is that Jesus, the people who were healed and raised from the dead didn't just live at that moment, but they continued to live on, and some of them are still alive today.
Wow.
So so you can see the hidden implication. If you want to check this out, you could find people that are still around that were healed. So it's almost like 1 Corinthians 15 with Paul saying, "So not all have died." But actually, maybe what we could do is there's a thought experiment I do in the book, and we spoke about this before we started recording about verifying information, because I think that would help kind of fill in why it's important that people did travel around and compare teachings. And by the way, if you know any more early church fathers that did this, just let me know. But anyway, so Swan, if you want, I could do the exercise real quick.
And do the exercise.
Yeah, because I heard you do something very similar on one of your programs. Okay. See, let's go into Wayback Machine. I don't know if you remember Peabody and Sherman, but go into Wayback Machine to the 1st century. And we're in the church of John the Apostle, right? And it's during service, John the Apostle's preaching from his own gospel, and he's preaching John 6, and he says this is something to do with the Eucharist. Okay. Now we're skeptics, right? We're like, I don't know. I read the text and I think it means something else. It's symbolic or something. Well, how will we know whether our interpretation of the text is true or whether John's interpretation of the text is true, right? Well, we could talk to John after the service, and John could give us a number of reasons why we should believe his interpretation. First, it's his gospel, right?
Yeah.
Second, he was there. He heard
Uh-huh.
Jesus. And maybe Jesus explained his words to his apostles that just wasn't recorded. So he could say that. He's inspired by the Holy Spirit, and therefore he has the spirit of truth, and this is what he believes is true. Okay, that's good. Those are really good reasons. But we can actually do more. We can ask the congregants, did you know, were you there? Did you hear what Jesus said? Did you get the feeling it was Eucharistic or something else? And they might be able to fill in some blanks. But even better, you could travel to the churches of the other apostles because they're still around.
Hmm.
And you could ask them, John 6, how did Jesus ever explain what the meaning is? What did he mean when he said this? And if we have these multiple attestations that all coalesce to a single point of meaning, right? It doesn't have to be exact, but it just has to collate to a single idea, like it's Eucharistic.
Mm-hmm.
Then we can be rest assured that there is a single source that predates these attestations, and therefore we have good reason to believe Jesus actually taught it, right? So we can verify the meaning of that particular text. So someone will say, okay, that's fine when the apostles were alive, but what about after the apostles died? So in my book, what I do is we go in the time machine to Ignatius of Antioch, okay, who was a second bishop of Antioch after St. Peter. Let's say he's preaching on the same thing. He says it's Eucharistic. How do we know he didn't fabricate that thing? So we approach him. He says, I learned this from Peter or John. How do we know that? Well, we could ask the congregates, were you around when Peter was in Antioch? Did he teach this, right? And you could even go further. You can go to the churches known to be established by the apostles, do the same thing. And probably right around this time, you could also check out the liturgy. You could check out the hymns being sung. There's all sorts of data points you can use. And again, if you have multiple attestation that coalesces to a single point, that verifies it must have a single source, and it has to be Jesus. And you could just do this thought experiment. Then you go to Irenaeus of Lyon, and Irenaeus, I think, implicitly states that he did check it out in multiple areas, right? Because in Against Heresies, book 3, chapter 3, he says that the whole world has the same faith, right? Essentially. So anyway, you could ask him, and he could say, well, Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, taught me this. You could go to Polycarp's church. You could ask the people in Lyon, was this the predecessor's teaching? I mean, ultimately what it comes down to is this model: antiquity, ubiquity, consensus. That which can be traced as far back as you can go, that which can be attested in all areas, and that there is a near consensus. You don't even have to have a perfect consensus. If that works, then you can verify it. And the funny thing, Swan, as you're working through this thought experiment, what you find is, as you're going further and further away from Jesus, our ability to verify innovations actually becomes easier and easier.
Yeah.
Because you have a lot more data points that you can work off of. So have like Arius, excuse me, he comes up with a heresy. It's like, oh, it was located originally in Alexandria and spread from there. So one location, not ubiquitous. It wasn't a consensus till later. And we don't really find anything like that prior to Arius. So we know Arius is an innovation, right?
Yeah. And if I could bring something in, obviously there are going to be questions about like the New Testament canon. And obviously that wasn't settled until maybe Pope Damasus, when Athanasius also proposed the 27 books, although that didn't universally settle the issue, obviously. He was proposing them and making arguments for them. You're basically pointing out that in the earliest days of the church, the earliest centuries of the church, well, this is just an aside, but Sola Scriptura was not in action. You very much relied upon the authority of your bishops and the oral tradition. You had to use every resource that you had possible, and you oftentimes didn't have the whole New Testament canon. You might have Apocrypha mixed in there, Gospel of Peter with your Gospel of John.
Yeah,
That's going to get a bit dicey, right? But so, Gary, I guess before we end today's episode, is there anything else that you want to talk about with respect to your book, or anything else that you want to bring out?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the canon.
Because I know that
I,
is a chapter in your book on
oh
the
yeah,
canon.
yeah, absolutely. And because, like you said, you could be the church can expand. Maybe certain local churches are missing books. Maybe they didn't get a full collection of books.
Hmm.
Maybe some local books kind of edged their way into the canon. The only way you know that is ultimately like by the time of the fourth century, then you can see in the surveys, you know, antiquity, ubiquity, consensus, where it may not be that clear if you're in a local church much earlier on. So there's actually more clarity that goes on later on. Yeah, I talk about, well, if this is true, then how come everybody isn't lockstep, right? Why isn't it like word for word accuracy when it comes to the meaning of a text or something like that? I go into that. Um, I also go into early church fathers that are frequently proposed as proving that this doesn't work, that they actually got things wrong.
Hmm.
Um, and I go into that as well. And probably the last thing I'd point out is I think the strength of my approach is that the same approach that I just gave for understanding or verifying the meaning of a text is essentially the same methodology used for verifying how our copies correspond to the original. So it's like the same methodology can be used not only to establish the text, but establish the meaning of the text, to
Yeah.
establish the canon of the book,
Mm.
of the Bible. It has multiple uses. So if someone says, no, this methodology is totally unreasonable, you
Mm.
got a huge problem because that means the methodology that establishes your Bible, right,
Uh,
is unreasonable. So now where do you go, right?
because I remember you talked about basically what's known as multiple independent attestation,
Mhm.
where basically, like, if you want to, in the historical method, if you want to verify with historical confidence if an event happened, you want multiple sources independent of each other converging on that same point. And you were using that, uh, in the context of in the early Christian church or throughout the early history of the church, if you wanted to verify the meaning of a text, if you wanted to verify I don't know if this thing happened, if you had multiple bishops around the world or multiple successors of the apostles, and by that I mean more immediate successors. Obviously, the bishops are successors, but more immediate successors like Polycarp
Yeah.
and Ignatius. Then, if they converged independently of each other on this point, then they had a common source, which was the apostles and thereby Jesus. So that's actually really cool that you're using a method in one area, but showing it can be used in other areas. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, Tertullian has a great line. Actually, I'll give him the nod to Rod Bennett because I'd never noticed this till he pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
Tertullian says that, I'm going to paraphrase,
Sure.
chaos doesn't fall into or trip into order,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
It's always order trips into chaos,
Yeah.
right? But when you find that uniformity, right?
Hmm.
And in my book I show what kind of uniformity we're talking about. We're not talking syllable by syllable lockstep uniformity,
Yeah. Yeah.
but rather uh, a more general understanding.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it has to come from a single point because, like I said, chaos doesn't fall into order. Order
Mm.
falls into chaos.
Well, Gary, before we end today's episode, could you talk to us about like where we can find this book for anyone who's interested, and just any of your other works? You have a website, other things like that.
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you. You go to stpaulcenter.com. That's ST Paul Center, all one word,
Hmm.
or Amazon. You can pick it up there. For my website, it's handsonapologetics.com. And I have links to my stuff. Or Catholic Answers publishes a lot of my books. That would be another shop.catholic.com. I
All
think
right.
that covers it.
Well, Gary, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. I've had many people want to have for me to bring you on to talk about the canon, and so I'll see if I can organize a little something along those lines. But that'll be maybe down the road. I still got
Yeah,
to finish my interviews for this month and other things too. So, Gary, it's been a pleasure.
it's been a pleasure too. And it's great to talk to you again. And I'm going to ping you again to get on my show. So
All
beware,
right.
there's an email coming.
All right. There we go. That's totally fine. All right. God bless you.
You too.
Before we end today's episode of Intellectual Catholicism, I do have one last thing to say and to share, and so let's do that real quick.
Hi, I'm Father Michael Lee. I am the administrator of St. Luke Byzantine Catholic Church in Sugar Creek, Missouri. And I just wanted to appeal to you today to pray about helping us in our moving project. I've been the administrator of St. Luke for the last 5 years, and in that time we basically have doubled our size. We went from a congregation of kind of the low 30s up almost into the 80s. And we're just really trying to find a new space where we can expand and grow and offer this beautiful apostolic brand of Christianity to anybody that wants to come. So we were just appealing for your help. If you would like to get in and help us to move and to grow and to be able to have this unique and beautiful expression of Catholicism, please visit our website. It's byzantinekc.org. And on the landing page, there's a donate button that will take you to another website that you can donate electronically. And we really appreciate anything that you can do, and we're praying for you. God bless.